Welcome to this video on Harjo versus Seminole Nation Election Commission, docket number 2024 SC09. This case addresses critical issues before the Supreme Court of the Seminole Nation. Our video explores tribal election law, focusing on administrative authority versus legislative intent. We will analyze the separation of powers and examine constitutional rights, including equal access and due process. The core of this case is a legal challenge to the sudden imposition of a last-minute notary requirement for absentee voters by the Election Commission. This change impacted the fundamental right to vote. The appellant is Tallahassee Harjo, a candidate for principal chief who challenged the disqualification of 412 absentee ballots. The appellee is the Election Commission, the administrative body that issued the emergency directive requiring notarized ballots. In the 2024 general election for principal chief, Harjo suffered a narrow defeat with a 104-vote margin. The disqualification of 412 absentee ballots represents a margin nearly 4 times greater than the final vote difference. The emergency directive was issued just 14 days before the election. This sudden administrative mandate required notarized signatures on all absentee ballots and was implemented without legislative approval from the General Counsel. A total of 412 absentee ballots were rejected. The primary reason for this mass disqualification was the sudden emergency administrative requirement for notarized signatures, imposed weeks before the election. Harjo's challenge asserts that the notary requirement constituted unconstitutional disenfranchisement. Key arguments include a lack of legislative approval, a violation of equal access, and the retroactive and burdensome nature of the change. The district court upheld the Election Commission's directive. The lower court found the commission had inherent authority to protect election integrity and rejected due process claims, citing the need for ballot security. The key constitutional arguments on appeal are the separation of powers and due process, and equal protection. The appeal challenges the commission's inherent authority and the unconstitutional barriers created by the retroactive requirement. Point of error number 1 is the separation of powers violation. The commission assumed legislative power by unilaterally altering voting eligibility requirements without approval from the General Counsel, making the directive ultra-vires. The legislative supremacy argument emphasizes that the General Counsel holds plenary power over election law and the franchise. Administrative bodies cannot add new requirements, as law modifications are reserved for the people's representatives. The expressio unius doctrine argues that defined statutory procedures preclude additional hurdles. By explicitly outlining election procedures, the General Counsel implicitly barred the Commission from adding material requirements like notarization. Tribal precedent requires transparency and accountability for actions affecting fundamental rights. Administrative directives must reflect representative consent to prevent arbitrary power and ensure codified standards are visible to all citizens. Point of error number 2 is the violation of due process and equal protection. The retroactive notary rule burdened a fundamental right, lacked adequate notice, and disproportionately harmed rural and elderly voters with limited notary access. Voting rights are fundamental, demanding the highest level of judicial scrutiny. Under this strict standard, the government must prove the challenge law is necessary to achieve a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to be the least restrictive means possible. The notary rule caused a disparate impact, disproportionately harming vulnerable citizens. This included elderly voters facing health risks for in-person notarization, rural voters facing high costs and travel time, and those with limited access to certified officials. The 2-week notice proved grossly insufficient, violating the principles of fairness and due process. This sudden requirement created a logistical impossibility for many voters and amounted to an unfair ambush that led to systemic disenfranchisement. The appellant's theory maintains the Commission acted ultra vires, overstepping its authority. By imposing an unauthorized mandate, the Commission compromised the integrity of the tribal constitution, necessitating judicial invalidation to preserve popular sovereignty. The respondent argues the Commission acted to protect ballot integrity and tribal security. This was an exercise of inherent sovereign authority, a legitimate oversight necessary to prevent fraud and ensure every vote is cast by a verified tribal member. The court must ultimately determine the limits of administrative discretion. Constitutional supremacy dictates that procedural mandates cannot become insurmountable barriers that extinguish the fundamental right to vote, requiring strict scrutiny of the Commission's actions.